Okay, here we are at week 5. Now, this is going to be the most difficult week you'll have done. We're going to be looking at evaluating arguments again, this time deductive arguments, and in particular we've got to look at the notion of validity. And this is a difficult notion to wrap your mind around, so expect to have a hard slog, but if you keep at it, you'll be fine. Right, just a recap as usual on last week. If you remember, last week we evaluated inductive arguments. Remind me what an inductive argument is? A percentage chance of being right. Yeah, I'm not sure that's quite the way I put it, but more or less. What's more or less likely? Given the premises, the conclusion is more or less likely, exactly, as opposed to a deduction where if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. Okay, so we looked at inductive generalizations and causal generalizations, arguments from analogy and arguments from authority, all different types of inductive arguments. And if you remember, we looked at these things. Now, I realized at the end of last week that I hadn't added that one on. So if you've got, you might want to go back to the handouts that you had from last week and just note that this week's handouts will have that one on as well. And it's fairly obvious what that is, and if it isn't, it will be by the end of today. Okay? So those were the tests for an inductive generalization. These were the tests for a causal generalization. These for the argument from analogy, and these for the arguments for authority. I won't go over them again because as we've started a bit late, I would rather get straight on to today. But if we have time left at the end of today for questions, if you want to go over any of the ones that we did last week and you can't remember them or you'd just like a reminder, ask me then and we'll certainly come back to those. Okay, but this week we're going to be looking at the distinction between validity and truth and at why validity is important. And we're going to finish both this week and next week with evaluating deductive arguments. We've actually already mentioned the distinction between validity and truth. Would anyone like to have a go at telling me what it is? It was about 3 weeks ago, so quite reasonable if you don't remember, and quite reasonable if you get it wrong, because we only mentioned it glancingly.
An argument can be valid but not true.
Good, yeah. Okay, an argument can be valid but not true. Why is that the case? Right, okay, you were doing, let's not push it. No, you were doing very well then. You're absolutely right. Statements or sentences or propositions can be true or false, but arguments can't be true or false. Arguments can only be valid or invalid. Do you remember that? We talked about that in the first week. And I said then that one of the things that will give you away every time to a philosopher or a logician is if you talk about arguments being true or false, or if you talk about sentences being valid or invalid, because it's like my talking about the table being loud. It makes it clear that I either don't understand the meaning of loud, or I don't understand the meaning of table, or I'm speaking metaphorically, might also help. So sentences, statements can be true or false, so premises can be true or false, conclusions can be true or false, but arguments can't be. And arguments can be valid or invalid, but they can't be either true or false. Okay, so we'll be looking at why that is in a little more depth today. And we'll be looking at why validity is important, because one of the interesting things about valid arguments, as you'll see, is that they can have false conclusions. And you might ask yourself, well, why should an argument that has a false conclusion be a useful argument? Never mind a good argument, but we'll see why in this session. Okay, right, first we're going to deal with the idea of soundness. And an argument, a good deductive argument, is sound if and only if it's both valid and it has true premises. So soundness is to do with both validity and the truth of the premises. So, okay, is this argument sound? Put up your hand rather than yell out. Put up your hand if you think this argument is sound. Do you see what I mean? This argument is valid and has false premises. Could this argument be sound? Put up your hand rather than shout out, I say. Anyway, you've all done it now, and you're quite right. No, that can't be sound, can it? Okay, what about this one? Put up your hand, because some people think more quickly than others, so give everyone a chance to think. As soon as you've decided, put up your hand. Okay, that's most of you. What is it? No. It's got to be unsound, hasn't it? It couldn't possibly be both. What about this one? Okay, what are you saying to this one? No. Okay, again, this one can't be valid. And so, what about this one? Yes, you can yell out this time. Yes. Okay, yes, that's right. That's got to be sound. Good. Okay, so there's the same thing filled in. Okay, now, so the two things that are both necessary for a sound argument, or a good argument insofar as soundness goes: truth of the premises and the validity of the argument. Now, the truth of the premises, and I've mentioned this before, is not an interesting matter for logicians, or for you, given that your interest is in critical reasoning. And the reason for that is that when we determine the truth or falsity of a premise, it's not necessarily a logical matter. It's not necessarily a philosophical matter at all. So if I say, is the chair blue, how are you going to determine the truth or falsehood of that? It's dead easy. There's no trick question here. You're going to look at the chair. That's right. Okay, if I say 2 plus 2 equals 4, is that true or not? What? Okay, yes it is. Okay, and how do you know? Yeah, I mean, you all know your basic arithmetic, okay? And you might say, okay, all swans are white. How do you determine the truth of that answer inductively and so on? So there are lots of different ways in which a premise would be determined to be true or false. And my job in teaching you critical reasoning is not to teach you how to look at a premise and decide whether it's true or false. My job is to teach you how to look at an argument and determine whether it's valid. Okay, are you with me? So when two characteristics of a sound argument, one is true premises, one is validity. I'm leaving it to you to ask about true premises. All I can teach you is what validity looks like, what validity is. Okay, so, yeah. Okay, validity is of interest to logicians because validity preserves truth. If an argument is valid, then if its premises are true, we can be certain that its conclusion is true. So it's the if here that's important. If the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. And so the validity of an argument preserves the truth of the premises. If there's truth there, it will preserve it. If there isn't truth there, it won't say anything about the truth of the conclusion. So we'll see more about that in a minute. Okay, so validity is truth preserving. That's why it's useful. So validity is of interest to anyone who's concerned with truth. It's not just true premises that concern you if you're interested in truth. It's also the validity of arguments. And that's because we often don't know the truth of our premises, and we often test the truth of our premises by constructing valid arguments and testing the truth of the conclusion. So let me go through that again. Okay, if an argument is valid, then if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. Okay, so we might have a premise that we don't know whether the premise is true or not, but if we can use that premise as the premise of a valid argument and then test the conclusion of that argument to see whether that's true or false, then if we can show that the conclusion of a valid argument is false, what do we know? If we can show that the conclusion of a valid... Put your hand up. If we can show that the conclusion of a valid argument is false, what do we know? Let me remind you again of the argument is valid if and only if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. So if we see that the conclusion of a valid argument is false, what do we know? Put your hand up when you've got the answer. A little bit longer. It's quite difficult to play with these concepts in your mind if you're not used to. So, okay, right. What do we know? Who wants to give me the answer? Do you want to have a go?
premises must be false.
Right, at least one of the premises must be false. That's right. They might all be false, or it might be just one of them is false, but we know that at least one of them must be false. So if an argument is valid and the conclusion is false, then we know that at least one of the premises must be false. And here's a couple of examples. Okay, smoking causes cancer. That's a hypothesis. We've based that. Okay, where do we get that from? What sort of argument might that be the conclusion of? An inductive argument. Good. So we see that this smoker's got cancer, this smoker's got cancer, this smoker's got cancer, etc. And we form the hypothesis smoking causes cancer. Okay, that generates a prediction, doesn't it? If we put that hypothesis as starkly as that, smoking causes cancer, it generates a prediction. If smoking causes cancer, then every smoker will get cancer, doesn't it? Oh, yes, it does. No, remember I said if we put the conclusion as starkly as that, sorry, the premise as starkly as that, that's the prediction it generates. Okay, the test or the conclusion of this argument is each smoker gets cancer. Okay? Now, if we look at smokers, we see that some of them get cancer and some of them don't we? Okay, so what do we know? This is a valid argument, isn't it? Yeah? Okay. But we've seen that the conclusion is false. So what do we know? That one of the premises is... Now, it might be that it's not the case that smoking causes cancer, or it might be the case that smoking could cause cancer without it being the case that every smoker would cause cancer. So what do we do if we're researchers at this point? What might be the case? We've got a correlation between smoking and cancer, haven't we? Otherwise, we wouldn't have that first premise. But it was not going to be an exceptionless correlation, is it? We've seen that. So we could say, we could decide to jettison the idea that causation is sufficient. So we might want to say, well, okay, it's possible for A to cause B without it being the case that A is sufficient for B. See what I mean? So we could jettison premise 2. So possibly